Welcome everybody. This video is about the V2, the Ausführung D Panther. In this video I will actually revive my Shelf Queen that is in a semi-finished or mid-project state and will finish it, slightly upgrading it using 3D print. And I will teach you a lot about this prototype version of what would become or what would be the Panther, an early Panther, the way you know it. You're watching Tank Brusher, 1/55 scale German armor. My name is Kai and let us dig into it. The kit we are working with is Dragon 6830. It is a 2016 re-release or upgraded release of Dragon's 6822. That was initially released in 2015, but with release of this book was for the first time showing how this vehicle looked all around the V2 Panther. This invalidated Dragon's first release, since the whole rear section of the first release was a standard Panther more or less, and they came up with this kit. Now I have filmed the complete building process and reviewed the kit, but the video is full of negativity and this is something I don't want for my channel. You can already guess where I'm going with this. This kit is not very good. Dragon's Panther Ausführung D, the first iteration of the Panther tank, is very weak in general. There might be an exception with a premium kit, but all in all I would recommend to stay clear of the Dragon Panther. There are companies like Meng and Takom nowadays. They don't offer this kit, but this kit in specific feels much more like a aftermarket conversion than it does feel like a full valid kit you buy and build out of the box. Now, enough of this. Let me show you actually the vehicle itself, where we are and where we start. So that's where I have to start reviving this project. I did try out a little bit a color modulation. Color modulation is more or less an over amplified volumetric contrast study that's it's quite commonly used in figure painting in the realms of Warhammer, for example, but on a scale model the Spanish school just doesn't connect with me, let's put it that way. So we have to figure out a new way or a better way to do a base coat. This Panther is very special because of its rear. And this doesn't look like a standard Panther rear, of course. We have different bins and a whole exhaust system with this muffler here laying horizontally is something we don't see on a normal Panther. Of course. There are more differences here. This complete plate here is shortened and this thing glued into it. Dragon makes us cut out the lower floor plate of the hull and they make us shorten this rear wall. And they make us fill some holes here in the center and get rid of stuff. This feels very much like a conversion kit or not like a model kit you would build out of the box. Now the problem with Dragon, again with the Panther D series, like I said, is you get a relatively late hull with the reinforcement in the front. This is nothing we would expect to see on the second prototype vehicle that was built. Next thing is we have to fill and sand all the interleaving armor plating. The V1 like V2 were made out of mild steel as far as I know, and they had no interleaving armor plates. So before I continue, another thing I replaced, of course, aside from the tracks, is we don't get these front fender extensions. They are 3D printed, we don't get the leather that was present on V2, and yeah, that's all a little bit problematic. Another thing that is rather special to this vehicle is the coolant water infill points are directly matched onto these radiator covers, and we will see in later production months this here being flame cut off, and then they are produced without this extension. So we have only the fuel filler cap in the rear. These air vents, of course, are special too. These are early styles. They usually are not supplied with Dragon. We get them only in this. In the front, everything looks a little bit normal. Another thing I had to do was to shorten the asymmetric style of travel lock. The initial Panthers use a symmetric one Dragon doesn't include this, of course. When we have a look at the turret. So what we can clearly see is the V2 has a different style of turret. It's an really initial prototype made from mild steel and so on. In the front we get a ball type muzzle that's unique to this vehicle here. Now there are smaller other differences, like the brackets here for holding the smoke dischargers, but nevertheless this is some smaller stuff. What could be noted is the different positioning of the hatch opening mechanism compared to a normal production series. Now let's get into it, finishing this kit actually up. There's an aluminum barrel. I don't know if it was included or if I have stolen it from another kit or if it's aftermarket. What you see here in front is a standard mantlet. This is wrong for this vehicle. The style of mantlet we actually want to use is one that has these sprue gates still left from the casting process. There are two ways to get around this. Our first option is to just steal one that is made by Meng, that's included in Meng's Panther D, and make it fit the Dragon one, since there are differences in the gun mount. Or you can join my Patreon or check out my description box down below, because I release a YouTube package of STL parts you can print yourself, or you can buy from my merchants in physical form then. So there is one thing I have to do on this mantlet, of course, and this is reapply some sort of texture, of cast texture. But before I do so, there's another small thing here on the side we need to take care of. As there's a very thin and small bracket, more or less, so a little bit of traditional modeling with a styrene sheet should actually do the trick for us here. That's an odd feature. I have not seen this before or after on any other Panther D, but this doesn't necessarily have to mean something. Now, in order to get the texture going, I need some Mr. Surface or something like this. Actually, today I have to stay acrylic here because I have to sit a long time in this room. I just use some Vallejo surface primer here. It will do the trick as well. And there does not need to be a huge amount of texture applied to it, just enough to tell the story. Now I hope this shows up on camera, but I just stipple this here on. And this will be truly enough. There does not need to be a huge amount of texture. Okay, that will now dry, and I think the whole mantlet topic should be done with this. For the hull, one problem I have to take care of right away is here the front, that is a little bit substandard, at least even for a skill set that is not there where everybody else's is. While the putty does dry, I would actually like to address another section here. On the rear, on the photographs, we see some stuff laying around, including seeing the key for the fuel filler being attached and some smaller shapes that obviously belong to the fuel filler system. But there's a hatch around here, and I 3D printed one to make this show up. In the past I have already attended to this area here more or less with just a piece of styrene rod that was actually substandard, so I had to remove it. But this hatch actually doesn't do all too much in my opinion. If I'm right, in this area there are the valves for the engine cooling system. Usually these valves are reachable through the engine hatch. So either this is an access point to the engine cooling system valves, or this is just a hatch laying around on top of the vehicle by reasons we can't comprehend today. So this is where we are at now. I finished stippling on the texture on the mantlet. The whole thing is prepared now. There were about 2 or 3 passes were necessary on top of what I've shown before. I sanded down the front, made this a little bit better looking. Now let me add a few parts of information to the rear. First, I think that these attachments or these cast residues are actually more for the successor of this vehicle, the Ausführung A. I did leave the track tensioning system on. I think Dragon advises you to remove it, but I see no way of reaching this track tensioning system from the inside, given how a Panther is laid out in the interior. There is pretty much no space for that. Okay, let's move on to the actual painting process, and me doing a voiceover from here to spare you from the compressor noise. I actually didn't want to cover this here in great detail, and I don't want, because you guys are all capable of laying down a base coat yourself. Short notice here, I use some Ammo by Mick paints. They don't like to be laid down in a thick covering coat, but actually they need to be built up in very fine coats. I'm doing this wrong here because it doesn't matter, it's just an undercoat of what will be a very dirty vehicle in total. Now I switch over to Vallejo, a dark gray, a random dark gray. I somehow changed my mind a little bit when approaching the actual color tone I want. Here in this case I want something that is a little bit brighter than the base coat I choose to use this gray shadow, but is still darker than the average color value, you would call this, of the vehicle. Going for this a little bit distressed look. I'm pretty sure the aircraft modelers do have a specific term for this technique. I myself don't. Now we've already blitzed through the base coat, and I do like the result actually. I have laid out some oil paints now, but I did decide to go for enamel paints instead, just because enamel paints do dry faster. They are a pre-made, prepared product, right, ready to use out of the bottle, and I don't have to F around with the oil paste. Nevertheless, I did choose to stay with the color scheme, using a dark earth tone as a base coat, and then building up with a mid-tone and a highlight that's almost representing a dry earth or dry dust. Looking at the references for this build, the whole vehicle can be described as being painted in dirt over a primer coat of dark gray. And this is what I want to go for here. There's no wash applied or no streaks going on before, no preparation for this process, for a simple reason: I don't have the time. The last 4 months did show if I want to go for a high-end weathering, it will not happen at all. Therefore I go for a speed painting approach, making the whole vehicle look well, but I do admit I don't weather all the details, don't go in every nook and cranny, and yeah, this vehicle was brand new. This vehicle was on a wet surface, it was complete dirty, and it was already dried up. And this is the whole idea I want to pick up for this weathering approach. After I have laid out and streaked down and rebuilt some of the base coats, I actually turned down the pressure on my airbrush really low, so the airbrush would start spitting out the enamel paint. And this is what you can see here on screen actually happening. The whole thing gets completely covered in flakes, and this is, I think, the brightest color I have in my palette, and I repeat the whole thing with the darker and the mid tones to get this look all over the model. And in total we trade off a lot of brush control we would have we do this the traditional way, for a lot of speed when doing with the airbrush. Enamel paint still being enamel paint, we can go in there and remove some of the material we didn't want. The brush is damp with enamel odorless thinner, and I can make my way through each of the layers I previously applied. And I did not pick this pattern randomly. I looked close at the references and removed the dirt from where I see it removed on the original vehicle. I'm very fortunate in the book I showed before. We have really good reference and pictures all around the vehicle. This is how the thing looks now with the base coat, I would call it, finished. And we are still missing the drive area, of course. For this area, I want to go a little bit darker than I was going with the rest of the vehicle, of course. Therefore, I use damp earth. It's a little bit more brown and a little bit desaturated almost. So this looks actually pretty good. And since I'm dealing with the drivetrain area now, I want to add some additional texture and not use this enamel paint as a standalone effect, of course. Therefore, I mixed some of my pigments. I will show this in a second. For now, it's just applying the enamel paint everywhere where I want to adhere pigments to. I go rather thick here with a good heavy coat. Like I said, this is not the final effect. This will not stand out when the pigments are actually applied to it. On the road wheels, same process, applying just enamel paint inside and outside. I think I show just the front of this, but it will be enough to actually give you an idea of what I was after here. So the whole thing is displayed in November the 5th, 1942 at the MRN, that's the machine company building this vehicle, at their proving ground near Nuremberg in southern Germany. This means there is some sandy, it's mostly a sandstone environment, there's some sandy, compacted, highly compacted ground that doesn't sink in too well. And we have mid-November. Usually in Germany, mid-November is already freezing in this area, or can be freezing in this area. Therefore, I go for a rather dark textured base coat. The pigments, you can see, they are much brighter. This is because this is my standard mixture. I made Rinaldi style. I think you are quite familiar with his channel. It's just a mixture of all of my pigments that are bright enough and look the same, but still are not the same, bringing a little bit variety in there. After I have applied the pigments, I make sure I clean up the road wheels again using a cotton swab here, drenched with some petrol or enamel odorless thinner, either or. And I remove some of the material back from the road wheels, making sure I keep all the technical details. The bolt pattern on these road wheels is very special. I think these are 18 bolt pattern on the outside. The standard Panther goes down to a 16 before it goes up to a 24. That's a real mess. I have designed all of them. I can't recall now, but yeah, that's actually a feature that should stand out in this build. Now here we are, the tracks are mounted, and I haven't spoken about the tracks. Before I do this in a second, let's just say I processed them the way I always process my tracks, and I made sure the sag is right. Hitting the road wheels about the two last road wheels is where the whole thing makes contact. There is only a small support roller on the final drive of a Panther Ausführung D. Let's have a look at the tracks we get actually in the kit. These are the typical Dragon DS tracks, but the guide horns are bent, but the guide horns are hollow. That's actually pretty good. These tracks do not look too bad, but not too good either. They're pretty deformed, and the way these tracks do bend around the sprocket, if it would sit right, is actually not looking like a single link track, of course. Dragon is very weak in this particular case. Now I've designed my own set of Panther tracks according to original specs, of course. This is a late one. I printed in about 1 to 5 here just for fun and for the sake of showing you guys. Yeah, this is a late type, but of course we need an early type. It's included in the YouTube package, and even more, these are early style of track pins. Now, just for demonstration where the difference is, that's the way these tracks clean. That's pretty nice, pretty fast. If you don't have a printer, for example, Bulldog Models in the UK is selling them, and I know that Tankcraft in the US is making them as a licensed product as well. Tankcraft has an exclusive design even. The way you stick them together is using 2 track pins, one from each side. And of course, me demonstrating this whole thing here, I will take a little bit longer, but the whole process should effectively be over in an hour or 2 in the evening. There is nothing all too special about this. It's just going so fast, and there is no additional cleanup necessary once this is broken from the raft. Raft is the print bed, basically. So I'm doing just these 3 links, but you can already see this is a total different story compared to the DS tracks. And they are much cheaper than aftermarket ones if you print them yourself. And nevertheless, they are they are better than white metal ones, and on the same level the competition is, basically. What is completely new to this build is me actually doing a vignette or a small diorama base, or just a base, how I would like to describe this. I have not done this before publicly, but I have done this a lot to my Warhammer figurines and my tabletop army, so therefore I have some idea what I do. I printed out a sheet for a base, and I stole some of the soil where my lady's lizard is living on. And yes, of course, the lizard was paid off in blueberries, I guess. It was a fair deal, at least from his point of view, I guess. Now, the good thing about this lizard soil is it's not a mineral sand, it's a soil. The relevant difference between both of them is a soil usually reacts much better to being processed in a home environment than a quartz sand would do. So I molded this down, since the corn size is not fitting yet for 1/35 scale. It's a little bit oversized, but it's actually a process of 10-15 minutes getting it down to the right size. Now I cover the base in PVA glue. It's a wood glue, a slow drying one, unfortunately, so it's not the express version. What I would actually like to address is, you can see this base is 3D printed on an FDM machine, and it looks 3D printed if you look close. I do not hide or address this, because I don't think it's a problem. If you use a wooden base for a vignette, you wouldn't care about some wood grain being there either. This is how the technology goes. I have not a wood workshop in my living room, but I have space for a 3D printer. Once the glue is spaced out, covering the complete blade, I just pour the molded down soil on top of it, and the whole thing looks somewhat like this now. And aside from having made a huge mess out of my camera workspace, this whole thing does not adhere by itself, of course. There needs to be a post-treatment, and the whole thing starts with actually spraying just water on it, making the whole surface wet and allowing for the wood glue to completely soak through. There's nothing special to the water I use, nor to the spray bottle I did find somewhere in the household. Okay, but actually what I would like to address now is I need to really seal this surface in, and therefore I diluted some of the PVA glue with water, and trying to use a pipette. Obviously right now that didn't work, so I just pour it on top of it. This will create some PVA puddles. These puddles are helpful in this case, since the reference pictures are clearly showing some water puddles there. The PVA glue, instead of the soil, will aid with this in the future process of using some wet effects later down the road. I do care about having a good amount of glue in the corners and all around the edges where I will touch the model more often. Yet to make sure this actually looks like a tank has driven over it, I press in a track pattern, and therefore I use my spare chassis I have sitting around. The whole year will be very Panther heavy. I have a lot of Shelf Queen sitting around. The DS tracks are good enough to put some profile into dirt basically, but not much use for anything else. To paint the whole thing, I use different variants of earth and clay tones. There is nothing special about it, nothing to really show. Yet I want to have a little bit a variation going on in the color tone. What I'm spraying on here is some clear coat. This didn't work out. I wanted to try out if I can make this look wet, but like I said, this didn't work. There was a larger caliber needed to make or to hammer this home. Next important step is to unify the model and its base, making it look like they belong together and not just two separate entities mating for no reason other than preserving space, I guess. Now I use this damp earth again, making sure the whole pigments, they were very bright and therefore they did dry very bright. I can tone them down now using this damp earth, make the soil look like it is damp earth again, and yeah, just bringing these color tones together. This is why I usually don't over weather or don't weather the drive area at all. My models are resting in a cabinet with glass floors, and this doesn't look all too good, to be honest. If you have a tank levitating there, therefore bases will be reissued to all of my already finished models. Now what I have pointed out here in the background was the actual wet effect that is needed. This is the larger caliber I talked of before. This is a enamel product again, like so often, and it's actually just a clear coat, I guess, a little bit a thicker variant that is here marketed as a wet effect, and this works actually pretty good. The reference pictures of the vehicle show these areas where no dirt is adhering to be actually wet. This is what I go for. I use a little bit a larger brush here, since I didn't film the refinement process. The refinement process was done with a much smaller brush and getting all the blends going and all the good stuff where the effect actually looks like it was applied and not just thrown on there. No worries, I haven't thrown everything overboard. Okay. Now, this paint actually works pretty well, and it's thick enough, almost too thick. So on the downside, I managed to preserve some brush strokes that shouldn't be there. This is something I have to be aware of when I do this in the future. For the drivetrain area, I pick out some random track links to be wet, as well as the tires on the vehicle. In my short experience I can say tires do respond very well of being displayed wet, but yet this enamel paint I used before, this damp earth, already has a sheen to it, and therefore there is no need to emphasize this effect. On the ground now, I use these Pva stains I created by pouring the stuff all over the base, now to make them look like they were a puddle, or where they are effectively wet. This is what I want to say. And this turns out very well. But one advice I would, next time I do this, I would let the base completely dry through. The enamel paint lifted some of the damp earth up and created some reddish spots where I didn't want them to be. Another alternative would be buying a specific diorama product. I've seen there are some puddle making products already available. Here on the engine deck I pick out some more areas I think that could be displayed wet or would fit together to tell the story. As I said, I did completely rework this off camera, making it a little bit look more refined. And this is the result of the whole thing. Like I said, it was speed weathered. The whole process took about one afternoon, and therefore I am actually impressed how good this can look. It looks like it belongs together. It does tell its story, but yet it's not refined to the point where I would get if I could spend afternoons after afternoons on this project. This time is all soaked up in 3D modeling and creating aftermarket parts for now. Nevertheless, I hope you guys did enjoy the build. I hope you got some inspirations for your own. If you did enjoy the video, leave me a thumbs up and subscribe if you didn't have already. Don't forget to check out my Patreon, of course, and thank you very much to all of my patrons. I see you next week with a review, and the week after with a completely 3D printed and self-designed model kit I will build completely from the ground up. Thank you very much for watching. Enjoy your hobby. Have a nice day.